Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I wanted to talk on China's increasing demand for Russian oil and how the Russians are meeting that demand. So, without further ado, let's get into it. I want to thank you for joining me this evening. I've just got back from work and I saw something and read an article as well. And the article is Russia's Pivot to Asia, which was published on the 11th of February. I'll put the article up for you to have a look at. However, it's really interesting, and I subsequently watched a video, which I'll also put up for you to have a look at. It's on the P Guru's channel. I've spoken about Sri Ayer's channel before, an amazing channel. He does a real in-depth analysis of things that are going on. And for those of you that enjoy, geopolitics and the like, I urge you to subscribe to his channel, go down to his channel and check out the content. It's amazing. And he's done quite a nice little investigation into this increase in the Chinese purchasing Russian oil.
Well, interesting things at work. Well, India said that it is reducing its intake from Russia, and China has stepped in to take that surplus from Russia. And that means that the dynamics are again shifting. What does this mean for India and for the world? We're going to take a look at it using a simple slide deck, and a request to all of you to please like this video, and if you have not subscribed to our channel, to subscribe to our channel. Here we go.
The gist of it is that the pressure that Donald Trump has been putting on India to move away from its dependency on cheap Russian oil. Now, the Indians have always come out and said that they'll buy oil from whoever they want to because it depends on what's in their national interest. We've seen them hold out against Donald Trump and they stood their ground. Donald Trump made a comment recently saying that India has agreed to purchase oil from the United States.
I don't know anything about that, but I'll tell you what, China is welcome to come in and would make a great deal in oil. You know, we welcome China. We've already made a deal. India is coming in and they're going to be buying Venezuelan oil.
Now, if you recall, there was Minister S. Shankar did mention in a conversation a while back where he said that, the US and Europe trying to force India to stop buying Russian oil. However, they've put sanctions on Iran. They had sanctions on Venezuelan oil. So you were boxing countries in and not giving them alternatives.
If countries in Europe and the West and the United States are so concerned, why don't they allow Iranian oil to come into the market? Why don't they allow Venezuelan oil to come into the market? I mean, they've squeezed every other source of oil we have. And then say, okay, guys, you must not go into the market and guess the best deal for your people.
And then you subsequently had, the ouster of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. That oil has now come under the American banner, so that's now on the market. But why I thought that this is really interesting is not because of the oil. I believe that there's an underlying factor here that a lot of people seem to be missing. So, China it's now buying 100% of the oil that I think is being shipped out from Russia, from the Siberian region. And Chinese imports of Russian oil have risen 46%, whilst the imports of oil from Saudi Arabia have dropped for roughly about 46%. So the Russians are definitely giving the Chinese a good deal on oil. But I also think that in geopolitics, everything that you see out in the open is not necessarily as it is happening behind closed doors. So I think as I've stated before, I think that there's a lot of backroom negotiations going on. I think the Russians and Americans did a deal. When you look at the way in which Jolani marched into Syria, into Damascus, and, literally, unopposed became the new leader of Syria. And then you look at the way the Americans went into Venezuela. And what I'm referring to here is the pushback from the Russians and the Chinese. And apart from a few stern warnings and, comments and statements, nothing much happened. I suspect that the Indians and the Russians have come to some sort of an agreement, because don't forget, India, Russia and China are in BRICS. So I suspect the Indians sat down with the Russians and said, look, we need to get our economy moving and get these tariffs brought down. And we've been buying this Russian oil since the Ukrainian special military operation began 4 years ago. Now it's time for us, that is the Indians, to move ahead with a trade deal, probably with the United States, with Europe and everybody else. And I suspect that is why, not only because of Trump's posturing, but I suspect it's also because behind the scenes, the Europeans became aware that between the Russians and the Indians, a deal was being done, and the Indians were going to move away from Russian oil. However, the Russians and the Indians, probably together with the Chinese, decided that Russian oil can then move towards China. So you see, one door is closing, another door is opening. But more importantly, what I honestly believe is my takeaway from this: Trump turned the tap off to the Chinese Venezuelan oil, for want of a better word. I mean, it's there, but the prices now will be regulated. The other country supplying China with oil, and the Chinese always do these deals, is Iran. And the Chinese were getting Iranian oil at a good deal, because Iranian oil was sanctioned oil, so the Indians had to wean off it. The Turks have also come off and put a halt to the amount of Russian oil they are buying. However, that doesn't leave Russia in a bad place, because Russia has now rerouted that oil to China. So I think the deal done behind was that the Indians, the Chinese and the Russians agreed to renegotiate and rejig this deal, where the oil still flows out of Russia and still keeps the Russian economy moving. But it also gets the Indians to be able to then get their tariff rate by the Americans lowered. And the interesting thing that I feel is happening here is that China pivoting towards Russia and purchasing this amount of oil from Russia means that whilst Netanyahu was in the United States today in a meeting with Trump, and whilst the reports coming out are that Netanyahu was pushing for military action from the United States against Iran, and Donald Trump came out saying that he's still looking for a negotiated settlement. However, if that is not possible, then military action will definitely go ahead. I suspect that the Chinese turning to the Russians to purchase this amount of oil is a signal that the Iranians will be left on their own. I really feel that when it's now open season on Iran, I think the Americans are going to hit the Iranians militarily, and I think that, as I've mentioned in my previous videos, all you'll get out of Russia and China is a little bit of, a few stern comments and it'll be forgotten fairly quickly because other things will be going on in the world. So I really, when I was listening to this talk by Sri Aya and P. Gurus and reading through this article, where this gentleman, Alexander Denitsev, director of Trade Policy Institute at the Moscow National Research University, Higher School of Economics. He talks about Russia's seaborne crude shipments to China hit a record of 1.86 million barrels per day in January, up 46% year on year amid falling Indian imports and rising US pressure on New Delhi to curb Russian oil purchases. So, Trump is a businessman. He is always looking to do a deal. And I think this is a short-term game for him. He will look at addressing the issue with China, but he's not prepared to take on the Chinese just yet. That was evident from the way he levied his tariffs against India and not the Chinese. Not in equal measure with the Chinese. So I think that this game is being played, like Ukraine is now for Putin to move ahead with Venezuela. The Russians and the Chinese looked away. Syria, the Russians and the Chinese looked away, and I think the Iranians also looked away in Syria. But I think that they are now going to feel exactly what Assad felt, because I think when the Americans do go in militarily, the Iranians are going to be on their own. And I think that this oil shift is a signal, because Trump is not shutting off the Iranian oil supply to China without it having another option. So it's just basically rejigging the chessboard. If I was the Iranian regime right now, understanding the economics of what is going on regarding this oil deal with China and Russia, I would really be worried. Because, we all talk about, the Chinese have deployed this missile system and the Russians have done it, and it's not done out of goodwill. It's being paid for. You then also have that when the Russians and Chinese do deploy these arms and ammunition and these radar detection and missile detection systems and anti-aircraft systems, it's not only that it's being paid for, but it's also a test ground to see how they perform against their adversaries' weaponry. So it's almost a proxy war. But you see, there was no diplomacy between the Russians and Europe when the Russians embarked on the special military operation in Ukraine. Trump has come in and changed that. So diplomatic channels have now been opened and they're secure, and it's ongoing. So in that diplomacy, the moment you open the door to talks, deals will be made. I'll do this for you here, but you overlook that there. Don't forget, a classic example of what I'm trying to say is that you'll hear all the time about the Israelis are saying this about the Russians are saying that about the Israelis, and, their adversaries. Do you know that when the Israelis were going to bomb, let's say, an airport in Syria, 20 minutes to half an hour before they bombed the airport, they would notify the Russians that they were going to be doing that they were going to be bombing that airport. The Russians would then evacuate all their personnel, and then the bombing would begin. So I'm saying to you, you look at, you listen to Naftali Bennett. If relations between the Russians and the Israelis were so bad, listen to Naftali Bennett. When the Russians went into Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky was terrified. He was sitting in a bunker, cowering there, and like a coward, and panicking because he believed Vladimir Putin wanted him to have him assassinated. And he reached out to Naftali Bennett, who then spoke to Putin and then went back to Zelensky saying, it's all nonsense. Putin doesn't care about whether you're alive or dead. He's not interested in killing you. And the next thing you know, Zelensky's in his combat fatigues, walking around and telling people how he's not afraid, and he's there to stand with his people. So I'm saying there's posturing and there's what's really going on. And I suspect this rejig of this oil movement between Russia and China means that the Iranians really need to up their game, because I think an attack on Iran is now imminent by the United States. And if you look at it, if Iran falls, the trade corridor between Israel, some of those Arab states, India, straight into Europe. It cuts out Turkey. It cuts out Pakistan. You now having, the Turks trying to create their own corridor. So the Chabahar port will then come into play, and that corridor instantaneously will go live. So there's a lot of geopolitical strategies being played behind closed doors. Again, the world has entered a phase where there's only strategic interests. The days of friends and allies and alliances are all over, because you continuously see countries fighting a proxy war with an adversary in one corner of the globe, only to find that these two adversaries are allies in another corner of the globe, in some other conflict zone. So it's all about balancing and managing strategic interests in this world today. So I want to thank you for joining us and taking the time to spend with us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Please remember to like, share and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps the channel to grow.